Khoshamdeed and Hosh Galdanas. Today we are going to discuss the remaining part of our discussion on modernist poetry and poets. I have already been discussed with you the characteristics, features and trends of the modernist English poetry, and today we are going to discuss the part 2 of our discussion that is based on the discussion of the prominent and representative modernist poets. So, as you can see in the slides, that I have just selected three prominent representative poets of the modernist era to be discussed with you, and however there are a lot of other representative figures, and I think we have to devote an other session for the discussion on the representative poets of the modernist era. But today we are going to discuss these three poets, and our discussion includes a discussion on T.S. Eliot, his important works and the prominent themes of his works. Secondly, we are going to discuss Ezra Pound, the representative poet as well as the towering figure of the Imagist movement. We are going to discuss his important works and the prominent themes of his works. And thirdly, we are going to discuss W.B. Yeats, who is an Irish poet, and we are going to discuss his important works and the prominent themes of his works as well. So, let's start our discussion from T.S. Eliot. Thomas Turner Eliot was born on September 26, 1888. He is a famous American English playwright, poet, and a critic. He is also a towering figure of modernist English poetry, means he is a representative poet of modernist age. His famous works are the love song of songs of J. Alfred Prufrock. It was published in 1915. The Wasteland, it is a modernist epic, and it was published in 1922. And the third important work is Four Quartets, and it was published in 1943. Among all these three works, The Wasteland is the representative work of T.S. Eliot as a poet. However, a lot of other poems are famous, like The Hollow Man and the love songs of J. Alfred Prufrock. But The Wasteland has its mark on the modernist tradition of epic writing. It's a modernist epic, and on one hand, it's not only an epic, it is an apt description of the modernist life that is affected by so many things: the moral decay, the war, and the disaster on humanitarian grounds. We can find all of these things in The Wasteland. T.S. Eliot has left a deep mark on the Anglo-American culture from 1920 onwards. His experimentation with form, diction, and versification has brought innovations in English poetry. Yes, and he has been experimented with the epic tradition as well, and that result is a very wonderful epic, a very lucid epic with the versatility of language as well as the versatility of theme. The Wasteland is a story of modern day life, that is a diseased life, the story of a diseased life of modernist society. It is representing the fragmented images of the modernist life, but the representation of T.S. Eliot and the diction and versification of T.S. Eliot is extremely remarkable. And as far as the question of classical knowledge is concerned, yes, T.S. Eliot was also interested in classical Greek myths and classical Greek philosophies, and he has also used the characters as well as the language of Greek, and he has also used expressions from Indian and Greek languages in this very epic, The Wasteland. Eliot had a vast study of metaphysical school of poetry. He was a well-educated person. He was a university scholar, but he couldn't complete his PhD. He couldn't defend his PhD because of um, the war. He also studied romantic poets like Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge with his scholarly intellect, but he did not get much inspiration from the romantic zeal of Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. However, he had studied them with his scholarly reason. T.S. Eliot is one of the most widely read, rather better to say, he's one of the widely read modernist poets, and he's one of the modernist poets with a zest of modernist revolt against the old poetic paradigms. Like I have already told you in the previous session, that modernists have set their own, they had set their own paradigms, and they got, however, they got inspiration from a lot of people, but they didn't follow any single one, like any one from the metaphysical school of poetry or from the romantic school of poetry or from the classicists. No, they didn't follow anyone as it is, and they got inspiration from them, but they used their own notions of poetry. Rather, they have created their own paradigm of modernist poetry. uh, T.S. Eliot is one of the realists as well. Eliot portrays the modern English life in its full swing in his poetry, and his poetry is an apt description of the fragmented English life due to the aftermaths of World War and the moral decay in result of these crises. Eliot's inspiration with Ezra Pound has led to the school of Imagism in poetry. Means he got inspiration from Ezra Pound, and in result of that, he got the imagist zest and imagist reflection in his works, and we can find the Imagism working in its full swing in not only in Ezra Pound's poetry but also in T.S. Eliot's poetry. Eliot's poetry is often sounds scientifically pictorial, because Imagism, as I have already told you in my previous session, it is different than Romanticism, and it is very scientific in its nature. And Eliot's poetry it often sounds scientifically pictorial. So the very element is a gift of Imagist's reason in Eliot's poetry. The second poet I have selected for today's discussion is Ezra Pound, an other representative modernist poet. He is considered as a widely influential poet of modernist era of literature, one of the early figures of avant-garde movement. Pound worked on many channels to develop aesthetic and intellectual interaction between Europe and US, and this is a very considerable contribution of Ezra Pound as a poet on the interaction between the aesthetic and intellectual channels of Europe and US, or the paradigms of Europe and US. His modernist epic, The Cantos, is known as his only epic in English. So, other than T.S. Eliot, he is also one of those poets who have tried with epic traditions. They have tried to write epic in modernist time with modernist zest, and with modernist themes as well. Pound also worked on translation of Chinese poetry with his meager knowledge of the language, because he wasn't proficient in the Chinese language, so he just tried out of his inspiration from Chinese poetry and Japanese tradition of haiku. So he was inspired of the poetic traditions of those paradigms. That's why he tried to translate the poetry of these languages. And we can find some works written by um, Ezra Pound, because of his lack of knowledge in or lack of so, due to the lack of the linguistic proficiency in those languages, those translations are just known as Ezra Pound's own works because they could not translate it properly. So, in this way, those works were created as new works. So, they are named after as Ezra Pound's poetic works. Pound's Four Poems of Departure is one of the example of such works. Pound's creative innovations have won him the title of the most radically advanced poet of modern time. But unfortunately, he wasn't a widely read person of his that time or a widely read poet of his time. But later on, he got popularity in different critical paradigms. As a representative poet of his times, Pound has devoted his whole energies for the advancement of modern poetic regime. Like Imagism is one of his contributions in modernist English poetry. In his revolutionary efforts for English poetry, Pound was supported by three other figures who are T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Robert Frost. The third poet we are going to discuss, the third representative poet, rather, he is from the early Romantic poets, W.B. Yeats. He is the third representative figure of modernist poetry and modernist era literature. So, we're going to discuss W.B. Yeats now. W.B. Yeats is also like Eliot. He was inspired of the classical Greek myth and classical Greek philosophies, and this thing is also depicted through his works. Another representative modernist English poet belonged to the Protestant Irish minority. Yeats was an Irish poet, and throughout his life, he remained staunchly standing for his Irish nationality. And although he spent 14 years of his childhood in London, but still he strongly believed in his Irish values, and he tried his best to represent the Irish culture, rather to celebrate the Irish culture in his poetry and as well as his other literary writings. W.B. Yeats has attempted to maintain the cultural and traditional roots of Ireland by featuring Irish legends, heroes, and freedom fighters in his poetry and plays. He is also a famous playwright of his time. He hasn't ever compromised on his artistic abilities, and he was also a scholarly figure, as well as he tried his best to fight for the Irish cause with the help of his works. Yeats was not among those who actively fought for Irish separation, but he fought through his works. So he fought through his ideas. He fought through his works, his ideologies that he was promoting in the favor of Ireland. He was one of those having inspiration for Greek philosophies and mythology, as I have already told you that it is depicted in his works. Particularly, I have just drawn an example of this. It is depicted in his poetry, like in his poem Leda and Swan. There is a revision of a myth, and in this very poem, there is the story of a girl that was eloped by Zeus, who was there in the guise of a swan. So this was again a mythologically inspired poem. So Leda and Swan is an example of his use of Greek mythological characters in his poetry. His early poetry is comprised of romantic themes and settings. He was one of those early figures who were inspired of the romantic zest. There came a transitional period in the life of W.B. Yeats when he met Maud Gonye. After meeting Maud Gonye, Yeats wrote with Irish nationalist zest because she was one of the representative freedom fighters of her time. She led him to get interested in occultism and later in spiritualism. And this thing is also depicted through his poetry, the use of occult practices and the spiritual themes. He was inspired of the poetic zest of Blake, Shelley, and Keats. Out of this inspiration, he published The When Among the Reeds in 1899. He was also a symbolist and he symbolically represented his inspiration with occultism in these poems. Another representative poem of W.B. Yeats is The Second Coming, and The Second Coming is also important because it shows his interest in spiritual powers and in religion and faith. So the Second Coming is basically based on a theme of you can say that it is based on uh, a symbolic representation of the Christ coming back into the world um, again by Yeats. The Second Coming uh, by Yeats is an apt example of his interest in modern day life in religious paradigms. Some of the important literary works, the poetic works of W.B. Yeats are In the Seven Woods, that was published in 1903, The Green Helmet and Other Poems, it was published in 1910, Responsibilities, that was published in 1914. So, this is all about our discussion on the modernist poets, the representative figures of the modernist English poetry, and I think we will try our best to have another session with some more representative poets of the Romantic Age. Thank you so much for today. See you in the next video with some new topic or with the same topic, means with the discussion on different some more poets, some more modernist poets. Thank you so much for today. Allah Hafiz.